So what do Black Ops, US foreign policy, the Gulf War, and FL Studio all have in common? That's what I'm going to be talking about today. So to me, like, the Gulf War has always been prime real estate for Call of Duty to venture into, just because they've like never really done it. And assuming they include a couple years prior to the Gulf War and a couple years post the Gulf War, I think there's a lot of material to work with. So now that Treyarch's been rolling out like all their marketing and things, I was checking it out to see what they had going on. And they have this website called thetruthlies.com. So I was playing around with the website, and you can scroll through channels. Some have videos, some don't. But I realized that you can download these videos. You hit the little record button and you can just download them. Which, side note, like there has to be a reason for that, right? Treyarch wouldn't include the ability to download the video unless there was some type of Easter egg. At least I'd imagine that. So anyways, I thought, you know, why not flip one? Let's make a beat from either this video or this one. I'm thinking maybe I go with this one and do like kind of a Yeet industrial 2093 vibe. What was the Gulf War, and why do I think that it would be good for Call of Duty to go there? So to give some context, Iraq invaded Kuwait in 1990. And the reason was Iraq and Iran were at war for like 7 or 8 years in the 80s, and basically Iraq owed a bunch of people a lot of money. Fun fact, the US actually gave Iraq billions of dollars in equipment and aid and training and intelligence and all sorts of stuff. But that's because the US really wasn't friends with Iran post-revolution, so it was in our best interest to kind of help keep Iran at bay. But anyways, one of the countries that Iraq owed money to was Kuwait. And Kuwait at the time was also going through some economic turmoil. I believe their stock market crashed like a decade or so prior. And something that Kuwait was doing was producing too much oil. And the OPEC countries, which Iraq and Kuwait were a part of, generally weren't a fan of this because it meant that they could sell their oil for lower prices. So Iraq was in a ton of debt to Kuwait. Kuwait was overproducing oil, and Iraq wanted Kuwait to forgive their debt. Kuwait was not having that. Another thing is Iraq claimed two things. One was that historically Kuwait was a part of Iraq dating back to like the Ottoman Empire. And Iraq was also claiming that Kuwait was slant drilling, which is like basically they were drilling under the border into the side. So they were supposedly, I'm not actually sure if this got proved or not, but supposedly one of the justifications that Iraq used for their aggression was that Kuwait was like stealing oil from them. So in 1990, Iraq said nope, and they crossed the border and they invaded Kuwait, to which the UN Security Council was not a fan at all. And they basically gave Saddam a deadline and said, if you're not out of Kuwait by this date, we will handle that. So as I'm sure you can guess, Saddam did not listen, and he did not get out of Kuwait. And because of that, the UN put together a group of a bunch of different countries, or a coalition of a bunch of different countries that included 500,000 Americans and 200,000 troops from other countries, including the British, the French, the Saudis, Egypt, and a bunch of others. So the assault started with like a month-long bombing campaign. You know, the standard playbook, destroy infrastructure, take out military sites, do as much damage as you can before boots touch down. So after these bombs fell for like a month, it was time to send in the troops. The Gulf War did not go well for Saddam. The actual boots on the ground operation, or Desert Storm, only lasted like 100 hours, like 3-4 days. But fun fact, some of the largest tank battles in human history took place during the war. Y'all think Activision will let me sell this beat? I personally don't. I personally don't think so. So yeah, like long story short, the US and coalition forces just like steamrolled Iraq and pushed them out of Kuwait pretty quickly. The American peoples loved this result. Bush Senior had like an 89% approval rating, which is 89% is just insane. Like, in terms of like casualty numbers, it really couldn't have gone much better for the coalition. It was something like 300 casualties on the coalition side, and half of those were friendly fire. Big shout out to the A-10. Whereas Iraq, like the numbers are pretty heavily disputed, but for this video, I'm just gonna say they had like between 20 and 30,000 casualties. No source, just vibes. You're gonna have to take that at its word. A big reason as to why it was so lopsided was, again, like this was right at the end of the Cold War. The ground invasion for the Gulf War started in 91 and the Soviet Union dissolved in 91. So while Iraq had, like on paper, a really formidable army with a bunch of troops and a bunch of equipment, the real crux of the issue is that it was a lot of old Soviet stuff. The Iraqis had things like the T-72, the T-62, the T-55. They had a whole bunch of MiGs, like the 29, the 25, the 23, the 21, and I want to say they had French-made Mirage F1s. The US, on the other hand, was honestly just looking for a fight. Like, the Cold War really made the military-industrial complex go burr. We had a whole bunch of new technology that we wanted to try out. So while the Iraqis had a whole bunch of old Soviet tech, we were fielding like Nighthawks, we were fielding laser-guided and GPS bombs. We had Tomahawks, we had advanced fighter jets like the F-16, F-15, and the F-A-18. So the US really used the Gulf War as an excuse to go try out all their new toys. So after like a month of bombing Iraqi targets and then a couple days on the ground, like I said, the coalition routed Saddam out of Kuwait and chose not to pursue. But the after effects of this are where I think Call of Duty can really shine, because the Gulf War significantly weakened Saddam's grip on Iraq. Like the Kurds in the north and then the Shiites in the south both chose to rebel. Saddam did not take too kindly to this and retaliated, but because of that, the US, and I want to say the UK, anyways, UN forces set up no-fly zones, and yeah, that's like just kind of a quick summary about the Gulf War. So why do I think that Call of Duty would be able to make a good campaign in the Gulf War? I guess that's like the actual purpose of this video. It's for a bunch of reasons. The first one being is if Black Ops 6 is a direct continuation from Cold War, you gotta get Ronald Reagan in it. You gotta. I don't make the rules. I'm just coming up with them. But like Reagan is an interesting person to talk about, especially in the context of like the Cold War. A very popular school of ideology during the Cold War for American politicians was realism. And basically the concept behind realism was that the Soviet Union had their space and the United States had our space. So like I think Kissinger is who popularized realism, but the gist of it was like the US isn't going to interfere in Eastern Europe, or what was referred to as Eastern Europe at the time, because that was the Soviet sphere of influence. So assuming we didn't, do too much over there, the Soviets would have their space, we would have our space, each world power would have their sphere of influence, and everybody would get along without blowing up the world. Reagan wasn't a realist. Reagan was an idealist, and the premise the premise behind that was I don't care who you are or where you think you have influence. We are the United States of America, and we will bring our philosophy to your corner of the world. So a side effect of that was, Reagan liked to get involved. So I think if Call of Duty wants to pick up from Cold War, they should start with Reagan and Operation Cyclone, which was basically just the US gave a whole bunch of money and a whole bunch of weapons and a whole bunch of training to the Mujahideen in Afghanistan. Afghanistan can be thought of as the Soviet Union's Vietnam, and part of the reason for that is because the U.S. we were funding the Mujahideen. Funding the Mujahideen was very much a idealist type of foreign policy. A realist would look at Afghanistan and go, "Oh no, that's not really for us to get involved in. That's much more the Soviet sphere of influence." But again, Reagan did not care. So when the Soviets invaded Afghanistan, oh baby, we sent money and weapons and equipment. So especially with like Black Ops' whole theme going on, I think starting with some secret missions fighting against the Soviets in Afghanistan would be pretty cool, and that kind of sets the seeds for everything that happens in the Gulf War. So from there you could have a scene with like Reagan talking about supporting Iraq during the Iraq versus Iran war. Because at the time, Iran had just overthrown their government that was friendly to the US, and they were now staunchly anti-American. So when Iraq and Iran went to war, it was in the US's best interest to help Saddam out. Have like Adler go to Iraq and like help against Iran. So I guess like with Reagan, the storyline would really be sending Adler and Woods or whoever's around at the time off to Afghanistan to help the Mujahideen fight the Soviets, but then also send Adler and whoever off to Iraq potentially to help with like the Iraq-Iran war. And then both of those, somehow lead into the Gulf War. Another thing that I think Treyarch would do particularly well with would be the whole Gulf War syndrome, which is like an unexplained illness that veterans of the Gulf War experience. There's a couple of different theories about what causes it, but a lot of the symptoms include things like muscle fatigue, rashes, cloudy thinking, and insomnia. But yeah, there's a couple of different theories for what causes Gulf War syndrome. One of them is sarin gas, which again, Treyarch being Treyarch, I just think they would do particularly well with like the whole WMD chemical weapons angle. So I mean, like, super long story short, I think Treyarch is in a really good position to actually make like a good Black Ops campaign, because the Gulf War has some gems in it, especially if you want to get into like the shadier side of the US government and things like that. I think there's a lot to work with. I'm cautiously optimistic. We'll see how it goes for sure, but like Treyarch has always, at least in my opinion, just done a really good job at coming up with good campaigns, with making them interesting. Like Cold War was a really good campaign. But yeah.